Hello, welcome to the Cultist Simulator design stream. I'm Alexis Kennedy, Lottie's over there. This is the new headset she bought me, and this is Fever Tree aromatic tonic water, which might or might not contain gin. And I'd like to know if you can hear me okay. Please respond. They can hear me, wonderful. Okay, that'll make the stream much easier because I won't have to resort to mime. Yeah, so we've got the Dancer DLC coming out. I'm not going to stay in front of the camera. I'm going to keep drifting off to the side like a bad dream, but I'll do my best. We've got the Dancer DLC coming out next. Is it next month? It is next month. Yeah, Lottie's giving me a long-suffering look. And I wanted to talk to some of the design decisions I've made in the progress of putting it together, and some larger, more ambitious or ridiculous thoughts about design. So here's a problem when you're writing DLC for a game which is about slowly uncovering the truth and peeling away the layers of reality in order to understand secret wisdom. And the DLC tends to need to be more sophisticated and more secret. You need to turn the bonkers knob a little bit. And so trying to be coherent while also being obscure and interesting has been a challenge. It's even worse because there's two new ascension paths in the Dancer DLC, two new ways to win the game. One of those is related to heart, and one of those related to moth. So for the heart one, I'm already having to do this obscure but hopefully coherent narrative about shedding layers of yourself and giving up everything you are in order to become something you don't quite understand, obeying a motive that you don't quite get the roots of. And so having written that for heart, moth, being the power of whimsy and uncomfortable yearning, needs to be even more bonkers. So I have to start out at being obscure. I have to move up to being more obscure for the DLC. Then it's all about change and transformation, a sort of post-Ballardian impossible motive way. And then on top of that, I have to make the moth even more bonkers in order to stick with the nature of moth. And I have to write lines like, and I'm going to say this in a pronounced West Country accent because otherwise I'll sound like I'm trying to be overly serious and get self-conscious. Mouldy Warp's oldest lesson: between music, silence, or my skin will become as thin as rain. And in a way that makes sense in context, and it's given that the game is all these chunks of text scattered on cards around the tabletop, it's hard to know how this will land until it gets in front of an audience. So the secret weapon, which is the secret weapon language has that prevents it from being a sort of a porridgey soup of disconnected atoms, is our old friend grammar. So in order to make the moth and the heart content at all fucking comprehensible, I tried to embed them in game design, in system design rather, which is always my thing. And mechanical form helps entrain and support the actual content. And even the actual content is a bit of a dodgy phrase, because the idea of content as separate from format or context or from system in a game is, as any English grad will tell you, a deeply suspect proposition. So let me talk about the game design. This, as I'm sure you'll recognize from my high quality artwork, is the time counter from Cultist Simulator. And if you've done any of the ascensions or attempted any of the ascensions, you'll know that the way it generally works is, once you have a desire running, every so often a season of ambition will occur that will suck your desire into the counter. And then if it gets what it needs, be that funds or victims, hello, you'll advance to the next stage of ascension. And you get to the 7th stage of ascension, and you have to do a big spell. So for dancer, I wanted to make all this much more complicated. One, because I felt it needed to be more complicated, and two, to support some of the narrative of change, of becoming, and of self-sacrifice, which underpins a lot of the Heart and Moth stuff. So that blurry thing in the middle reads ecdysis, which is a biological term or a zoological term, meaning the shedding of a metamorphosing creature's outer layers. And also, ecdysiast became a sort of a punning term. I think it might have even been Heinlein who coined this for people who take their clothes off for artistic or commercial effect. You're a dancer at the Ecdysis Club in the DLC. It is possible, this is important, to become a dancer at the Ecdysis Club if you have bought the DLC without actually having the dancer start. You can get hired. It's a bit harder, but it's possible. This means that you don't have to wait until the dancer origin pops if you bought the DLC and really want to get out the new content. There are always ways in. But at the club, in the same way that you need to use reason to work at Glover and Glover, or health to do manual labour, or passion when you're doing painting in Vanilla Cultist, you'll need to expend passion or health. But I wanted people really to feel worried about expending their passion and health. If you read the content for the Ecdysis Club as it stands, the dancers are shedding often a lot more than their clothes, their skin or their memories or elements of their self, or they appear to be. And one of the so that was the design requirement, right? And that was I wanted this sense of menace there from the beginning to support some of the Heart and Moth bonkersness. And here's one of the other things that's entrained the way the Dancer DLC works is that visible? It doesn't really matter. It is visible. Hooray. But all it says is Foundation 1.0. I can't piss about with design in the way I could back in February and March this year. And I kind of can't believe, even now, that February and March this year is still making this game, which seems to be out forever. But you know, back then I could decide that we had a new category of thing that used in rituals, influencers, or I could decide that we had 5 stats rather than 3 or something. I can't do that now. I need to support not only the existing design, but people's existing saves. I've committed to supporting saves on the main branch from here on in. So everything has to work with what I've got, which is kind of good news because there's lots of gaps I left for later expansion, or things I didn't get to finish, or things I wasn't quite sure how to build, so I can repurpose them. But wherever possible, I need to repurpose things, and I need to tie things together. One of the reasons I wanted to do the Dancer DLC at the same time as Follower Wounds is because scars, which if you've been playing the beta branch, you'll know that your followers can now get if they get wounded, which enhance their ability but limit their lifespan. Scars are also now things that the player can get at the Ecdysis Club. So every time you put your passion or your health into a dance, there's a chance it can end up becoming a scar. And passion and health scars, the wandering heart, which means it's very hard for you to sit still, your joints start fusing up, or its moth equivalent, which means your features have changed so often that they really start to blur like rain on a window. Once you have one of these things, it becomes easier to do the dance at the Ecdysis Club, but you can't use them for other stuff. You can't paint with blurred features. And really vitally, if you've turned your health card into a health scar, it's much better for heart ascension, but it won't satisfy sickness or starvation if they come calling. So you need to be very careful about committing too much of yourself to the Ecdysis Club. Oh, no, one more thing before I go into that. And that's this icon. So I did my usual feckin' thing, which is I wanted to write gender non-specific content. Not only are there progressive reasons for doing this, there are also aesthetic reasons for doing this, and there are practical reasons for doing it. So I don't need to worry about avatars or switching pronouns for when the player's referred to. But doing that when you are a character who is taking your clothes off is hard, because the majority of people who've taken their clothes off over the last 10,000 years of recorded human history have identified or been identified as women. You know, the boundaries are soft, to say the least, but generally, if you go into a strip club, you'd expect the majority of the employees in most cities in most countries to be women. But I didn't want to make that the necessary choice. I expect that most players will assume that most of the time because of their cultural preconceptions. I also imagine that some players will have their own interpretation of what the gender is in the game, and I wanted the content to be able to support this. So writing content that's kind of sexy and a kind of about taking your clothes off while being gender non-specific is a challenge, honestly, these days I find quite enjoyable, because I got used to it writing the sex scenes for Sunless Sea. I had to do like 23 different sex scenes without being specific about what the characters, the player character's gender was. But it's a stretch getting up in the morning. So all of this, a lot of it can be taken to imply a female or a male presence or neither. But I've tried to stay gender neutral while being moderately titillating. A lot of the titillation, this will come back to with the apophenic stuff later, comes through in the gaps. When I was writing about, so sidebar, there was a discussion on the community Discord a couple of weeks back about the Gaiety girls, who were really interesting. They were, I've said, like the Instagram stars of the 1920s. They were attractive women who went on stage in moderately revealing clothing in light musical comedies. And that's where a wedding will be, Lottie says. I mean, I'm game if you are. Check out the cool ring. The Gaiety girls. So they weren't Gaiety boys. They were chorus boys, but one of the things the Gaiety girls did was marry into the nobility. This is a whole art imitating life thing, because a lot of the musical comedies were about people marrying to the nobility. And a lot of the Gaiety girls, you know, a good dozen of them would do that. It became so much a problem that the manager of the Gaiety Theatre put a clause in later contracts forbidding them to marry members of the audience. But there's all these baked-in assumptions. The Gaiety Theatre, I describe at one point the boards of the stage waiting bare and clean and hot and bright. And I think originally I said the boards are waiting bare and hot and bright. And that just sounded so filthy that I had to add the cleaning to take the curse off it a bit. There's a lot of stuff about writing sexually charged content, right? The difference between innuendo, implication, and outright filth is often going to depend on what somebody's mood in when they read it. And I can't do anything about that, but at least I can be judicious about my choice of words. Anyway, you don't need to perform a ritual at any point while you're doing a dancer ascension, heart on off ascension. The final stage doesn't involve a ritual in the sense that the term is normally used in Cultist Simulator. So you may still want to perform rituals. You may find it very useful to summon beasties or to try to get rid of detectives, but you can get through the whole game in theory without doing any actual culty magic, which I wanted to be the case because the whole dancer thing is much more instinctive and much more specific, much more I can't remember the word I was aiming for, but it wasn't specific. Anyway, much more instinctive and much more implicit. Thank you. Opposite of specific than the rites you do to ascend in Lantern, Forge, or Grail. But when you're doing dancers at the Exorcist Club, the dancers act somewhat like rites. So again, I wanted this sense of sacred dance without coming out and saying, this is back to trying to make the content coherent through the grammar of it rather than the actual text of it again. I wanted to get the sense of sacred dance of pursuing forms. The heart path is called the new form, the moth path is called the old form, without explicitly saying you're doing a spell. So you apply your passion and your health or your scars in slots in your dance job at the Exesis Club in very similar ways to applying different resources in the usual cultist rites. There's another slot for influence. So often what you will need to do in order to achieve the more higher level dancers is to go exploring the Mansus in order to find heart or moth influence of sufficient power. But one of the other things I've done, I think it's already on the beta branch, it's certainly going to be in the vanilla game at the Dancer DLC launch, is Vitality, Erudition, and Glimmering, the cards that you normally use to upgrade stats, are now also influencers. This is back to the Foundation 1.0 thing. Influence has always been a bit of a poor stepchild of the game. They're the disposable things that have the one very specific use of being employed in the one rite that people often settle on doing. So I wanted more influence in the game, and I wanted more uses for them, and I wanted more fungibility between them. So you can use Vitality often in the dancers. The aspect level requirements for the dancers are relatively low because there are other more requirements I'll come to in a little bit. But you'll also need to use your Vitality to upgrade your health skill, because you'll to get access to the more exacting dancers with the large number of slots, like effectively more substantial rights, to get later into the Ascension, you'll need to be able to use more scars and more ability. So there's a couple of uses of Vitality. It becomes a more precious resource. There's a higher level of skill you can upgrade to as well. Well, one of the things that may or may not go in at launch is one of the squeaky wheels in the current game is that upgrading stats is kind of a pain in the bum, because you have to collect all these things whose time is you're juggling. So I've capped the degree to which you can upgrade skills and get new stats in order to allow me to make stats easier to gain. And I have a bunch of thoughts about that I won't get distracted on, especially because they may not go in for launch. But then, in order to be a dancer and to achieve this ascension through the dance, rather than necessarily reading any books at all, there are very, very minimal law requirements in the dancer path per se. It's a tiny bit of law in order to upgrade your health skill to the topmost level. You need to make sure that you are physically and emotionally equipped to do the work, and that you are doing it in the right frame of mind or at the most propitious times. And again, this, I hope, supports the text. So when I provide a card that says something along the lines of bibbly, 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 moth, bibbly, juices, then you've got enough sense of the context of this. This works as tone poetry rather than a Scrabble fart bath. Right. So two things here, three things. Well, one of which is illegible. And I'll move this up just to avoid confusion. Yeah. So you can probably tell which pieces of art on this board are Lottie's and which ones are mine. For years at Failbetter, I used to do drawings on the whiteboard and everyone would laugh at me. That's basically why I left. It's not entirely why I left. Okay. So why are you doing dances at the Exesis Club? Apart from the fact the Exesis Club is a really cool place. You're doing them in order to tear free some part of yourself by doing a mask dance, so it can walk the world as a sending of your spirit in the form of an animal. Couple of things about this. First of all, we want to put familiars in the game. We want to put shape changing in the game. So it made sense to do some art assets now that we can use for familiars later. So in principle, anything you see as an animal shape in Cultist in the next big drop should show up as a familiar later. But that's not definite. Some won't, and some might be changed. But that's the principle. The other thing is, oh boy, I mean, look at this. We've still got 2 pieces of paper to go. It's already more elaborate than the process for Ascension for the other parts. One of the reasons I got a bit behind on this was I got into the frequent designer trap of getting over ambitious, and I wanted to do all these different things. I wanted to plug into the existing content and existing systems. I wanted to fix a bunch of the problems. I wanted to prefigure familiars. I wanted to tap into lore about the Greek fire dancers and the Eleusinian mystery dancers and Indian classical dance, and I all this sort of stuff. So I wound up with a big spreadsheet, which gradually became a huge spreadsheet full of loony. And I squeezed it so some of the loony ran out. And what has gone into the game is relatively loony light. But it really got very elaborate, so I had to cut it back. And one of the initial things was I was going to have full shape shifting in the Dancer DLC. And once you've done the right dance, you'd actually be able to turn into an animal, and you'd be able to walk the city doing it. It would lock out the work verb, because you can't go to work if you're a stoat. And while you're a stoat, you can like go and do dreaming in the dream bit of the Mansus, and once you stop being a stoat, it comes back. And then I became all these problems. I sort of started writing frantic notes about how to fix that. Did stoats have less health than humans? And what happened if you wanted to buy opium as a stoat? And once I got to what happens if you want to buy opium while in stoat form, I realized I needed to take a lie down. So I finished early that day and went back and took all the actual shape-shifting stuff out. And what's probably going to happen, we're still likely to end up with actual shape-shifting in some form, but a lot of the walking abroad in animal form is going to be the more folkloric and non-specific stuff. It's not like being a superhero. You don't turn into a wolf, bamf, but you walk the city at night in wolf form, or a wolf is seen in the city at night, which is supposed to be you. And this fits a lot of the ambiguity of cultists, a lot of the apophenic stuff later. But anyway, the reason you're doing these masks and dancers is so that you can then send out some part of yourself into the world in animal form. There's a bunch of folkloric traditions some of you will have come across that include reference to this sort of thing. And if you were doing a quasi sacred mystic dance with a mask in order to free an animal part of your soul that in some way had physical form, that was going out of the world in order to learn a lesson about how you would ascend to the next level, where would you go? The answer, obviously, is Kerisham and other expedition locations. So, well, Kerisham is the first one. So, for example, I mean, let me talk through the lore of it, because this the whole. Did I mention the spoilers? If you came here not expecting spoilers, sorry. The first sending that you manage from a dance is Viper Shape, and you're told to go and find the place, I think, where the sea folds against the land. And the first dance you conduct in an expedition is under the auspices of both the mother of ants and the witch and sister, who you may know are not generally the best of friends, but both are relevant to this. And there's a bunch of lore that ties into that. And largely speaking, the difficulty of the expeditions ascends with the difficulty of the dancers, because it would just be bonkers to do it any other way. Really basic design point. What happens if you need to go on a specific expedition, and you've already used up that specific expedition, getting some sthenic venoms so you can murder a detective? Really basic design answer. Fortunately, I have a bunch of default expeditions. So all the dancers occur on the default expeditions, like Kerisham or Noon, so that you can never lock yourself out. And really basic design point. If you really need to get Port Noon, you can't fucking draw Port Noon no matter how many times you explore secret histories. What do? Really basic design answer. Sulikana atmosphere. Say that 3 times fast. So one of the other changes, backing off the expeditions a moment, about the Dancer DLC is we have more explicit characters saying more direct speech things than we do in a lot of the game. They do exist. Mr. Alden will come and say some very specific and quite prickish things to you. But we have Sulikana and Mr. Igdistis, the 2 people who run the Igdistis Club, who are approximately associated with the Moth and Heart paths, respectively. I always have sympathy with them. And you can go to Sulikana and ask her for some advice. And one of the ways you can ask her for advice is to say, here's my secret histories lore. Please tell me where Karishim is so I can go there and do my Viper dance. And she will convert that into a Karishim expedition for you, which means that once people have worked this out, there's a lot less drawing and swearing. And again, one of the things I generally want to do is, as part of improving the base game, provide people with more control over the order expeditions happening and where they can find expeditions, and more specific content outcomes of going on particular expeditions than just you tend to get this bit of treasure more often. There's more of this in Christopher's build, but some of the stuff I wanted to begin baking in now. So you've got some influence over what expeditions you find. Anyway, once you've found one of these relevant expeditions, you can put your sending in it. There's an extra slot in some expeditions now to put a sending on as usual. The whole expedition proceeds as usual. If you fail, your sending comes back with no harm done. I thought about killing the sending and making you go through it again, but that seemed needlessly mean. If you succeed, there's an extra scene you get at the end where you're sending dancers with one of the names of the hour who oversees this stage of the path in order to learn a particular lesson about the next stage of ascension, which you then feed back into the time marker. So the whole cycle goes through you doing a dance here, you using influence and improving your skill in order to do more challenging dances, pushing a sending out, completing an expedition, bringing a lesson back, and then when the season of ambition comes around, using that lesson with your ascension to level up. And then something else happens at the end when you pass through Leaf and Ivory and Adumbra, and you'll find out about that next month. But about this Leaf and Ivory and Adumbra, actually, I'll stop for questions for that. Anybody ask anything particularly cogent? Excellent question. Omatidia is the plural term for the individual photoreceptive elements of an insect's compound eye. And it is relevant, although not extremely relevant, to this content. But I mostly shared it. It was just such a beautiful word. I think the two things, there are a couple of specific implications about allegiances among the hours, which I think will set some of the more hardcore lore miners abuzz. And I am genuinely interested to see how people react to the content. It is meant to be risque without being explicit. It's a difficult line to walk, so it will probably strike some people as absurd and some people as bewildering and some people as filthy. But I think some people will enjoy it. It's yeah, you know, 25%. I'm not aiming that high. A name I remember from Fall in London. Yep. It's a good question, and the answer is we have a Grail Ascension already, and it made sense to tie Moth and Heart together because they both have this skin shedding aspect. If you know anything about the origin of Heart, you'll know what I mean by skin shedding. Because of some, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So the question was, Cultist Club started out as Moth and Grail, but now I'm talking about always Moth and Heart. What's up with that? And the answer is I wanted somewhere to put the Heart stuff, and the Moth stuff made sense. It also makes sense for an occult nightclub of unearthly delights to be Grail. I mean, it'd be bizarre if it wasn't. And in fact, just the other day, in the development build, I added a Heart aspect to the Grail to the Cultist Club, so it is now Moth, Grail, and Heart aspected. So it's just developing ideas of stuff. If things had gone differently and the Grail Ascension hadn't been one of the early Ascensions, it might well have ended up being Moth and Grail dancer paths, because the Grail had a very close relationship to the Thunderskin, the power that oversees the Heart Bath. So it would have made sense. But no, it was developing ideas. No. So the question was, sorry, we'll be able to use questions like Forge's Redemption, which turned decrepitude back into health, to deal with scars. And never say never, because 3 months from now I could very well either realise that the balance is off and it needs fixing, or that I have an idea I can't bear not to put in the game. But the thing about decrepitude is it happens whether you want to or not. Unless you really have some bizarre run strategy that means you're going to use decrepitude to amass funds by being a beggar, you don't choose to put it in. A lot of the thematic core of the Dancer, the thematic core of the Dancer DLC is giving up what you are in order to become something else, becoming something less along the way. So I want giving up your health to turn into a scar, to provoke a genuinely ambiguous emotion, ambivalent emotion, so that one, you now have a 4-heart tool, congratulations, that you can use in dancers and get through the high level dancers, which are very hard to do without some scars, congratulations. But also, there's no going back. You've changed what you are now. I'll keep going if there's no particularly relevant. That is actually the next thing. That's why I wanted to stop first, because it was a big thing. So I looked before the. Sorry, I'm at a shop. Hello. I looked before the stream and I noticed. I think Mark again had asked if there's any content I tend to write over and over again, if I tend to go back to and keep rewriting. And the answer to that's quite sort of pragmatic. The stuff that gets rewritten most often is either the stuff that's long, because there's more bits in it I want to fix and I often want to try to shorten it, or the stuff that people come at from multiple angles. So recipes tends to get a lot more rewriting and reworking than item descriptions, for example, or book titles, which will tend to come entire and stick, because even if they're not perfect, they're what they are. But if I realise that a recipe might link to another recipe in a way I hadn't quite expected, and the progress from one to the other looks weird, then I may want to rewrite it. But not always. And any of you who have ever been to a talk of one of mine, or for that matter, been stuck in a lift with me for longer than about 90 seconds, will have heard me talk about fires in the desert. And the idea here is that we, as designers, we have access to very small parts of the player's experience. Most of what happens in a game is inside your head. So we can give you these points to navigate between, like campfires in desert at night. But you decide the order often that you pass between them, and you decide what happens to you between the campfires. You decide why you've chosen one path over another. You decide what the path is, and that path belongs only to you. And this is one of the elements of apophenian design. So apophenia, and the adjective is normally apophenic, apophenian sounds fancier. Apophenia is the tendency of the human consciousness to experience patterns where none exist. So the really basic example of this is, and I'm stealing from Scott McCloud in his book on comics, Invisible Art here. What's this? Okay, we all know what this is. It doesn't look anything like this at all, but you recognize it immediately because we filled in the gaps, we spotted the patterns. If you're a writer making low budget, narrative heavy games that rely on a lot of creative interpretation by players, then you spend a lot of time giving people this. So sometimes if I write a recipe and another recipe, expecting people to interpret them in this particular way and go between them, and actually somebody goes through a different route and comes through a whole bunch of different recipes or actions or story elements and comes back here and finds something that I didn't intend, sometimes that's just a bug. Like very early on, when it was possible to make a policeman disappear by painting him into a canvas, by using him as inspiration. So that wasn't something I intended, and that's something I threw away. But it's very easy to imagine, you know, straight away people are like, oh yeah, but feature. And it's very easy to imagine where that could be an unintended feature. It so happens it's monstrously unbalancing. If you could just make upgraded Connie Lee disappear by painting her, that would make the game much easier. But often allowing the players to pursue their own progress and to make their own interpretation of what's going on is a really fruitful experience both for the designer and the player, because it becomes much more of a creative partnership than just me, ironically, standing here talking to you. So that's one half of it. And the other half of how that's relevant is the aspects, the primary aspects in Cultist Simulator. Heart, Moth, Grail, Edge, Winter, Secret Histories, Lantern, Knock. Is that's all? Yeah. There's no reason it was those 9 particularly. I mean, Grail and I think Lantern were in there from very, very early on, from pre the JavaScript prototype. But there was an aspect called Mask, which knocked around for a while. Edge nearly wasn't a thing at all. Winter nearly wasn't a thing at all. Heart was called a couple of different things. Edge was called a couple of different things. And, you know, whether the aspect is called Edge or Knife or Bone, as it was at one point, but that was too easy to confuse with Winter. All of these things spark different apophenian responses in players. And if you think about the interplay between, for example, Bone and Blood, compared to the interplay between Edge and Grail, these immediately give you different paths to go down. I mean, for example, in Edge and Grail, we're immediately thinking about the sort of ritual equipment you might see on an occult altar. Bone and Blood, we're thinking about medicine or sacrifice or something internal. So nearly all the significant names in the game go around a whole bunch of cycles. This is where we come back to this. Leaf, Ivory, and Adumbra are the first steps on the first 3 steps on the they're not the first 3 steps, actually they're 3 of the steps on the Dancer DLC Ascension path. But they've been a whole bunch of different things. There are ones that some of you have seen in earlier versions of our #open production design documents that haven't made it into the final version, and other ones that did. So a lot of this whole idea of apophenian design is trying to provide the most fruitful points of light in the desert for people to navigate between, the things that allow people to make the connections you want and also the most possible connections. It's a lot like cutting a jewel, so that even though it's the same jewel, the facets reflect light in as many ways as possible, and not necessarily the reflections you want. If you're a jeweler and you're cutting a jewel, you don't know how it's going to reflect light in different circumstances. But you do know what's going to make it reflect most light in most beautiful ways in most circumstances. Same thing if you're a writer and you're writing about how the stage is hot and bare and clean and bright. You can sort of reasonably deduce that hot and bare and clean and bright sounds less filthy than hot and bare and bright. But it, you know, different things in different circumstances. But you can try to cut the facets the right way. Anyway, apophenian design. This goes back to a conversation with Brian Bucklew and Jason Greenblatt, both very unlikely names. I promise you they're real. They make a game called Caves of Cud. We had lunch with them at GDC. They were very nice, both of them. They make a game called Caves of Cud, or Cud, which is a sort of crazy text-based, I think finally out of early access, I'm not sure, roguelike thing. And there's some overlap between our interests. But it was, I think, Jason who started using the word apophenic, which I knew the meaning of, but hadn't thought about in years. And this helped a lot of things come together. And here are some thoughts if you are making, or thinking of making, or interested in making, or interested in people who make a low-budget, narrative, text-centric game that requires creative input from the players, something like that. Or if you're just a fucking indie developer, or you plan to be an indie developer, or trying to get out of being an indie developer, here are some principles you might find useful, because I have. And here are the things I think about when I think about apophenian design. And the first thing is the stack. The first thing is the stack. And by the stack, I mean, if you think about, for example, a website, you got your database, you got some server stuff, and you got stuff that happens in the client. If you're not technical, then you're probably aware still that some stuff happens in your browser and some stuff happens over there in the cloud. Stuff that happens in your browser happens close to you and is very quick, but is limited. Stuff that happens over there can have access to a lot more information, but takes stuff farther away. And it makes sense, at least to me, to think about a player's reaction to the game in the same way. Simulation doesn't just occur in the game. Simulation occurs in the game layer of the stack. The computer decides whether or not you managed to upgrade your ascension card to the next level. And in the player layer of the stack, in between the player's ears, the player decides whether or not they give a fuck. They decide whether they understand it. They decide whether they find it sexy or frightening or both or neither. They decide, and this is the interesting bit, whether they succeed at this time in the ascension, because after all, they've tried loads of times and their characters finally learned, or whether it's because they've been doing lots of rituals that deal with heart, and that maybe that carried over. None of this stuff is real because it's just the RNG, right? There's a 70% chance of success, and that's happened this time. It didn't happen the last 3 times. But then none of any of it is real because the stuff that's actually happening in the computer isn't actually happening either. It's just flipping ones and zeros. So if you are a designer, it's worth thinking about the fact that the things that happen in the computer are no more real and no more important than the things that happen in the player's mind. If you could just write the word foop and it would make your player have an experience, that would be amazing. It doesn't work. You need to spend 9 months dealing with different versions of Unity, 18 months dealing with different versions of Unity to build a game that will make people have experiences. I'm not suggesting we just give everyone a box of colored bricks to play with and say, make your own entertainment. But always bear in mind that the stuff that happens on the computer, on the hard drive, in the machine, on the screen, it is fundamentally less important than the stuff that happens between the player's ears. It is only important at all because it makes stuff happen between the player's ears. And the relevant point here is prior art. Once you start thinking simulation occurs between the ears as well as in the computer, it's easier to remember that we have been creating simulatory experiences for a very long time indeed. Books, opera, paintings, music, all of these things are simulations. They're not interactive in the usually understood sense. You don't perform an activity on them and receive a response in the way that you do with a game, but they cause a simulation to occur in the player's brain. And here's the thing. Once you can simulate a thing, it's very tempting to simulate a thing. So here's what happens to a lot of new designers, including me, it happened to me, is you think, okay, I'm building a city, and in the city you can buy stuff. Let's say the city's called For London, and the stuff is called Whispered Secrets. What happens when you buy stuff in the world? Oh, well, the price goes up and down. Oh, okay, I'll simulate that, and it'll be a live ecosystem, and people will be able to manage supply and demand, and it'll be... If you do that, what generally happens in most games most of the time is that nobody really understands why the prices change. They just change according to effectively the whims of chance. And a very small number of people corner the market and get really rich on hoarding whispered secrets. Coincidentally, this appears to be how cryptocurrency works. But as a designer, it's very tempting to put in that simulation. It's going to be a living ecosystem. It's going to be amazing. And then realize that the player's experience is still largely, sure, but how does this affect me? Soren Johnson via Sid Meier, Soren Johnson, the designer on Civ 4, Sid Meier, if you don't know who that is, write his name out 100 times, has a good line about how there are games where the player's having the fun and games where the designer's having the fun. If you're embracing apophenian design, then you really want a game where the player is having the fun, where you are doing the least, most elegant work possible in order to make things happen, get simulated in their head, rather than trying to simulate everything in the computer, where a lot of it won't even reach the player. Skeleton watchers. Skeleton watchers are watchers you can see the works of. Some people like them, some people don't. I think few people would deny they're fundamentally attractive objects. Clockwork is an interesting thing to look at. Here's another interesting thing that's to look at: game systems. You're designing with an apophenian effect in mind. You want to create your effect in the player's mind. You want to do it with the least work possible on your side, because then you can expand out and have a much greater effect. So you want to take advantage of as many possibilities as you can to have the effect on the player. Text is one way, art is another way. Experience interactivity is another way. Understanding the game system is yet another way. So let me run that past that one again. The player getting an effect from a game system is different from the player understanding what's happening in the game system. If you're playing Cultist Simulator and you're doing the dancer ascension, and you put your heart in and it turns into a heart, your health in and you turn into a health scar, you'll think, oh fuck, you'll have an effect. If you think, yeah, that makes sense because I'm sacrificing stuff, you're consciously aware of it, it can enhance it for you in the same way that understanding a poetic form, or understanding a musical tradition, or understanding an in-joke in anime makes sense of it in a meta way for you. So I think if you are taking a more apophenian approach, you want to make your systems as visible as possible. This is the other big advantage, that you're being kind of respectful to the player. You're not giving them a magic box that spits things out. You're making them visible. And it has the other advantage, it's a lot easier to QA. So like every recommendation or principle, there are exceptions and specifics. I don't want to put out the result of every calculation in Cultist Simulator to the screen every time I do it. I've let people work out that the chances in the game, the percentage chance, are nearly always 100, 70, 30, or 10, rather than saying 70% chance every time, because there's also an effect on immersion from showing people numbers the whole time. But there's real value in showing people the system you're using. And if you look at something like RimWorld, if you look at something like Civilization, even if you look at no, it's gone out of my head. But there's lots of games, not just strategy games, that make a virtue of showing you their system that like a skeleton watch, make the internals beautiful to look at. And I think this is possible in a way it wasn't 20 or 40 years ago, because by and large, and I notice this every couple of years, I notice it's inched up again, the level of sophistication on display with player discussions of design keeps on increasing. In the early 90s, you wouldn't have got anything like the discussions you have in Steam threads a lot of the time. I mean, obviously, lots of Steam threads are full of homophobes being angry with each other. But I think having the same kind of conscious engagement with your audience when you're building systems that musicians have with their audience when they're writing music is achievable in a way it wasn't 40 years ago. Oh, Lottie, look what it says on number 4. It says production. I think one of the things about taking an apophenian approach to design is it beds in very nicely with embracing and being realistic about production. If you start out saying, we're a quadruple A studio and we are going to spend $500 million creating the most sophisticated procedurally generated planetscape, cityscape, forestscape the world has ever seen, there will probably be a lot of talent engaged in the project. It will probably be a good project, but you will necessarily overlook a lot of the effects of being less photorealistic and more suggestive and implicit. If you're working then at the indie end of the industry, you really want to make every pound, every dollar, and every hour of work count, have the maximal effect on your players. And letting players find meaning in the gaps is a really good way of doing that. I'd go as far as say it's an essential way of doing that. I wouldn't have been able to make Cultist Simulator if I hadn't made that my main point. Same with Sunless, same with Fallen London. Less graphics, more design, and less graphics, more design. It fits well with embracing the necessities of production. Anyway, I'll write that up as a blog post at some point. It's been germinating a while. Lottie won't let me call it a manifesto, so I won't call it a manifesto. It would make me sound like a cock. She's right, but that's my thinking. Right. I'm just going to talk about my process briefly because it was relevant to some of the stuff earlier and to Dancer. No, you know what? That's boring. I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, right. We've got 5 minutes to go. Hit me with questions. Yes. Hello. I'm in shorts, like a professional. Really? Right. It's because of my flatulence. Hello. Thank you for the national tea. Yes. So the question was, if you need players, you want players to buy into apophenian design. What was the second middle part of the question? How do you get players to buy into unlikely links and patterns, or you just leave breadcrumbs and let them join the dots? Overwhelmingly the second. But the analogy here is how do you get a meal to taste good? Do you just throw the ingredients in and hope it works? I mean, fundamentally, food with more spices in is nicer than food with fewer spices in. But that doesn't mean all spices are equal. It doesn't mean that just putting in spices is enough. You have to trust the player. And this is, again, something I say a lot in interviews when people ask me about narrative is I think, as an industry, the thing we could improve most is on trusting our audience. It's easier to say this at the indie end, where you have to have a niche audience to survive anyway. It'd be a lot harder if I were in Redwood City at EA, trying to explain how a franchise that was meant to serve 500 million people needed to be difficult and inaccessible. But I think you have to throw the breadcrumbs and leave room for the players to make their own connections. If you're making the connection for the player, then by definition, they haven't made the connection. It doesn't belong to them. When people get really excited is when they have an experience that they have partly created for themselves with the help of your game as a tool for experiences. Oh, yes. Right, so first of all, Lottie's reminded me to say something which is slightly tragic. The long hunting and tainted blood stuff is not likely to be in Teresa's build. It's likely to be shuffled into Krista's build. This is because what? Oh, sorry, no, it's not likely to be in Teresa. I do. It's not likely to be in Teresa's build. We're probably going to release it in the middle of Krista's build. So it's probably going to come out before the main Krista's build. It's probably going to come out in a few months rather than 1 month, November, December, that sort of time, but not yet. We got a bit behind. Partly was my freelance work, partly was bloody school open days all the last week of September, and I have to take my kid around them. And also, it makes more sense, I've realised, to do a couple of the advanced victories at the same time, because they use the same mechanics. So that's me announcing the delay. Sorry, guys, that feature is going to be, sorry, folks, that feature is going to be a bit later than we'd expected. And the question was, remind me. Yes, will we see more content on the beta branch before the dancer drop? The answer is yes, but I don't know how much. I would expect to put Romance and Rebellion out in the branch before we go live. I may hold most of the Dancer DLC back a bit because I want it, we both want it, to be something to look forward to in October. So there will be more, but I think on reflection, the Dancer DLC, you might see a little bit more of it, but this will remain probably privileged for October. I did talk about this earlier. So the question is there any text I spend more time in the game writing than book titles, recipes, so forth? So either the very, very basic text, like whether it's going to be edge or bone or knife, that the aspect is called, that gets a lot of sort of rewriting, like rolling stones around in a tumbler to smooth them. Or the text that is long tends to get more rewriting for obvious reasons, and the text that tends to be approached from different angles, where it suddenly doesn't make sense kind of a particular angle. So that overwhelmingly tends to be the recipes. Book titles often are pulled out of my arse, or inspired by something specific, or are a particular joke, or are a reference to a bunch of other things. The other thing I think is worth mentioning in this context is the longer something's been in the game, even if it's not been released to players, the less likely it is to get changed. So the fact that a leaf, ivory, and a dumbra, which is a lovely word for the bit of the shadow between the penumbra and the umbra, are the names of stages along the Dancer Ascension. You know, each of those has 3 or 4 different references to other things in the game or in mythology. And if I change one, it's like putting a tower out of Jenga. I need to change a bunch of other stuff too. So the longer it stays in there, the more it gets embedded into the content files as well, and into my notes, and the less likely it is to change. The health skill is necessary for improving your ability to access more demanding dancers in the ecdystis club, the highest upgrade of the health skill is necessary to access the most demanding answers. Fix restart. As far as I know, restart. Sorry. Will there be new specific requirements to start new legacies, and will be fixed restart so it starts on the same legacy? As far as I know, if you hit restart, you should start on the same legacy you were on 3 seconds ago. If it's not doing that, it's a bug. So it is up at the support address. It was a bug at one point, and it wasn't doing that. I thought I tracked it down, but I thought I tracked it about 3 times. So it might still manifest sometime. The Dancer legacy will, 80+% certainty, be available if you have won a work minor victory, on the basis that if you've just lent into a comfortable retirement, your next character might want to be doing something a bit more showbiz. But also, the Dancer Ascensions, all the ecdystis club content is available in principle to any character in the game if they do the right set of things, which Sudakana will give you some clues to. It's possible that we'll put some sort of UI element into the game that says if you just bought the Dancer DLC, click here just to start it. I'm disinclined to do that because by the time we got to 3 paid DLCs, that'll be ugly as sin. And I'd rather find more elegant ways into it. And you can just end the game and then edit your save file so you can get into it. But if we get a rush of complaints from people who really want to play the Dancer content right now and have bought it and can't get into it, then we might rethink that. But TLDR, there's a relatively straightforward way to get into Dancer. There's a way to get most of the Dancer content that doesn't require starting as a Dancer. And there's a very easy way to edit a text file to get into it. That's it. And is that 5 o'clock? Hooray! Thank you very much, everybody, and I will see you next month.